body is first taken to the house of the dead, or it can be a lean-to structure or whatever. It's a temporary structure. It's known as the ibu sort of thing, but its meaning is place of purification. And here the body is first washed with palm wine and rinsed with Nile water. Nile water was considered sacred to the Egyptians because it was a life-giving force, as we see in the agriculture of Egypt. Without the Nile inundation sort of thing, they wouldn't have had the food or the wealth that the country sustained itself on. Then we pass to the Wabat, and that is where the actual evisceration takes place and the actual creation of the mummy begins. And when the evisceration begins, as we see here, a cut was made generally in the left-hand side of the body. There are exceptions to every rule, so don't forget that. But in most mummies that are examined, this cut does appear on the left-hand side of the abdomen. And I would hazard a guess that that is because the heart is primarily to the left-hand side of the body, so you have a direct correlation to this side of the body. That is just a supposition on my part. I have no documentation that backs up that theory. The internal organs, with the exception of the heart, are at this point removed. The body cavities were then dried and cleansed with wine and honey, and again, unbeknownst to them, this helped to slow down the decomposition process through microbial action at any rate. The liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines were individually washed, packed in natron, and dried. They would then be wrapped in linen, and each of those would be placed into a specific canopic jar. The brain, as I mentioned, was removed generally through the nasal passage by inserting a long hooked or copper probe. And there are examples of mummies, as I said, that have had the brain removed through the orbit of the eye, or as we know now, through the foramen magnum upstairs. And of course, the eyes were either removed during this evisceration process or were lost due to the dehydration process, but they would later be replaced with false eyes of some kind. So we get on to the organs themselves. Here they are here, and you can see that these are packages of organs that have yet to be placed into the actual preservation jars. And so natron is a naturally occurring mixture, and it's more of a soda ash and a salt, like baking soda, than anything else. But it would be found essentially around lakes that had a higher saline content. And there were a number of areas where Egyptians literally collected these salts and brought them to these various centers of mummification, because they did have centers of mummification as they had necropolises or cemeteries. And all of the rags and linens and things like that that were used during the cleansing and purification process, those were often preserved and retained and interred in the tombs with the deceased as well. Because everything that they did was considered a part of that individual and a part of that person's either ka or his ba. So therefore, you couldn't just throw anything away willy-nilly. So after the 40-day drying period, and essentially the drying period would be, they would literally pack the entire cadaver internally, externally, with layers and layers and layers. Much like if you've ever had salt-crusted fish, sort of thing that's been baked in the oven, same deal with mummies. It's then covered, it's then uncovered and massaged with fragrant oils to make the skin supple and to rehydrate the skin afterwards. And that's when the bandaging process would begin. The cavities, this is showing the brain being removed through the hook going through the nose. And this is the drying here, where you can see the body being entirely encased in natron. And then these are the cavities. In the cavities themselves, they would be, because they were trying to create something that resembled a living being, the body cavities would be stuffed with something, whether it be straw. There's evidence of straw being used, there's evidence of mud being used, there's evidence of linen being used, there's evidence of bundles of other things being used. Anything that reforms the body would be there. So the bottom image just sort of shows bundles of it, but those bundles would also contain more natron or drying salts. So this drying process would continue even after the mummy was bandaged and wrapped and interred. And as I said, artificial eyes would at some point in this process of wrapping have been included. So the removed organs, this is the cleansing. After the salt has been removed, of course, the body is again washed and dried again, and then this is when they start anointing it with fragrant oils. And the removed organs here are again wrapped in linens, and this is where they get placed in specific canopic jars. And as you can see, the body is stuffed with dried materials. Oh yes, I forgot sawdust and leaves. Yes, did read all this stuff at one point. Just can't remember like I used to. I think it's called old age. Anyway, in the early kingdom, canopic jars generally had plain lids. And in the intermediate and middle kingdoms, lids were often represented as the various gods that they represented. But there's also evidence of them, especially in the New Kingdom, of having human heads. If you look at, there's an image coming up here showing the canopic jars from King Tutankhamun's tomb, and the jars have human heads exclusively, but yet they still represent the four protecting gods. They are, as I mentioned, the four sons of Horus. The first one is Amset, as they called him Upset, but he's also known as Imseti. And he is the only one of them that always has a human form. And each one of them was generally directed to a compass point. So his direction is actually positioned south, and his role is to protect the liver, and his protecting goddess is Isis herself. Duamatef is the jackal-headed son of Osiris, and his direction points east. East was the direction of the dead, as we say, because the west, I'm sorry, should be the other way around. West is living, east is the dead, because the Valley of the Kings is to the eastern side of the Nile, and Luxor, which is today Luxor, is to the west. I'm sorry?
Valley of the Kings, western side of the Nile. West is always dead because that's where the sun sets.
But yeah, I was right the first time. I got myself twisted around. Thank you. Yes, I don't know why I didn't remember that, because yes, as the sun sets, and the sun sets in the west, that's right. Thank you. You bailed me out. I need that sometimes, Then you get a train of thought going, and suddenly, geez, I think I screwed that up. Anyway, Duamatef was the jackal form, canopic jar. His direction pointed east. His role was to protect the stomach, which, being a jackal, kind of makes some degree of logic. and his protecting goddess is Neith. Happy is the baboon-formed son of Horus, and his direction faced north, and his role was to protect the lungs, and his protecting goddess was Isis's sister Nephthys. And Kebethanuf was the falcon form, and his direction pointed west, and he protected the intestines. And his protecting goddess was Serket or Selket, and she is the most famous one that we see in most of the iconography from Tutankhamun's treasures, with a scorpion sitting on top of her head. She's absolutely gorgeous. In fact, all of them are, but I think that scorpion is quite remarkable. The jars, of course, are then packed into a canopic chest. These are the 4 sons themselves, and there's the breakdown, and then they're placed into this canopic chest. This is the alabaster chest from Tutankhamun's treasures, and you can just see carved on the corners the protecting goddesses. But within that, this is the shrine which that chest was encased within. And there are 2 of the goddesses, Selket on this side, and we have, I believe that's Isis on the other side, because she has the steps, or yeah,
That's one on her.
yeah. And above it, on both the shrine and the enclosure itself, are the uraeus with the sun discs, which are very powerful images in Egyptian mythology. The wrapping is important because the head and neck were first wrapped with linens, and then the fingers and toes were individually wrapped. But before they were wrapped, if it was a wealthy patron, shall we say, or a pharaoh such as Tutankhamun, the fingers and toes could be encased with caplets of gold, you know, and there are some images of those coming up as well. The abdominal incision was, someone asked if they were actually closed in some way. The closure was actually the amulet, which is a 2-finger symbol sort of thing. And that finger amulet has been interpreted to represent Horus or Anubis themselves, and it basically prevented evil forces from entering the body during that, through that evisceration incision. But there was no actual physical closure that we're aware of, you know, and of course the arms and legs were wrapped individually as well. And as I said, these amulets were incorporated, you know, in the process. And if we look at the mummy of King Tutankhamun, I believe that there were more than 280 such amulets included within the wrappings of that particular mummy. And when we think of the very short reign that he had, we can only imagine what a pharaoh such as Ramesses or Seti the Great might have contained if we had found them completely intact. They, of course, you know, their mummies had been despoiled at an earlier time, but at least we have their mummies because they were found in a mummy cache. Spells and incantations, of course, are occurring through each step of this layering process, and with each placement of an amulet, there would be an associated spell or an incantation. Eventually, this is showing the wrapping process beginning, and these are some of the toes and finger covers that we may see in a very wealthy mummy. These are actually the toes and fingers of the pharaoh Susenes I. This is the most important protection amulet. You have the scarab beetle, which is placed over the heart, and then you have the vulture amulet, which is the goddess Nekhbet. Nekhbet was really important, and in the case of Tutankhamun, it was a great pectoral that was laid from shoulder to shoulder just beneath his throat. Nekhbet was responsible for restoring breath to the mummy. And so it was really important. When we get, and these are some of the amulets and what they mean. I won't go through each and every one of them, but you can see them, and this will be in the written material, so you can refer to these. I think there's several of them, several pages of these alone, and but these are the most significant ones. But there are many, many others. You know, there are entire books published on the number of amulets. But you can see the two fingers here. I wouldn't even try that word myself, but you can see in blue there what the Egyptians actually called the fingers. And this is what was placed over that embalming incision. And
can you go back to the Eye of Horus?
Certainly.
And just tell us, just explain that one a little bit.
Okay, the Eye of Horus. Okay, the Wadjet eye is really important because Horus, of course, had two eyes. The left eye was removed in his battle with his uncle Seth, and it was scattered. The right eye, somehow or another, too, was taken out at some point, but I don't remember all the specifics. But essentially, the two eyes represent the sun and the moon, and when they were restored, they became this. But the left eye specifically is the Wadjet eye sort of thing, and it's most common of all of the, and it literally meant eyes, and the one facing right, the other facing left, you know, as I said, mean the sun and the moon. Does that?
Yeah, and then, so they're always in the coffin lid to represent, why are they there?
They're there because the Eye of Horus, you know, there were several different methods in which the Ka or the Ba could move between the spirit world and the tomb, and the Eye of Horus is one of those methodologies. If you look at the casket that's up in the gallery there on the inside of it, there are two eyes there. That is actually the passage by which the spirit or the mummy can travel from the coffin into the real world again. And in some of the other representations, you have the false door. That's another method which replaces it. So the Egyptians are very pragmatic.
Yeah.
You know, for when we get to the Hall of Judgment, for example, the heart and the feather of Mot, the scales of justice need to balance. But the Egyptians are so pragmatic that they also developed a whole bunch of subsidiary spells and incantations, so that if you're like me when I was answering the questions on the interactive of there, I just crossed my fingers behind my back and lied to everything, and therefore I went forward, because if I answered them truthfully, I was gobbled up, you know, sort of thing. So anyway, you know, there are ways. So, but the Egyptians were that pragmatic that they, you know, thought, okay, just in case everything doesn't balance, we'll use some other spells and incantations and see if those will do the trick. And so if you look at these numerous scrolls, which we, you know, collectively call the books of the dead, there are all kinds of little isolated spells and writings in there that are sort of secondary safeguards to help you to get past that Hall of Judgment.